Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Okay, so you know how we all think a bowl of cereal is like the go-to for a healthy breakfast?
Right.
But what if I told you that there are other foods out there,
Okay.
like chickpeas and lentils, that might actually be giving your body way more of the nutrients it needs?
Well, you've hit on something that researchers at the University of Adelaide have been looking into.
Really?
Yeah, they did this really interesting study where they compared the nutritional content of pulse products.
So that's chickpeas and lentils, right?
Exactly, chickpeas and lentils, and they compared those to the cereals we usually eat, like oats and wheat and corn and rice.
Interesting.
And their findings, which, by the way, were published in the Journal of Food Composition and Analysis, they're pretty surprising.
I bet. Well, for this deep dive, we've got a couple of sources to help us break it all down.
Okay.
We've got a health news article that gives a good overview of the research, and then we've got the original scientific paper itself, which goes into a lot more detail for those who really want to get into the weeds.
Sounds good.
So today, we really want to dig into which of these foods that we all eat pretty regularly pack the most nutritional punch.
Right.
And we're going to be focusing on some key micronutrients like zinc and iron. And we'll also talk about why our bodies are better at absorbing these nutrients from certain foods than others.
Makes sense.
And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of how to choose the most nutritious foods for you and your family.
Yeah, because, when you think about it, getting enough of those micronutrients is a big deal for everybody.
Absolutely.
Especially, for certain groups like children and pregnant women.
Right.
The World Health Organization even points this out, saying that micronutrient deficiencies are a huge problem worldwide.
Okay, so let's jump right into this study.
Okay.
What exactly were these researchers trying to figure out?
Well, their main goal was to see just how nutritious those cereal and pulse products that we see all the time in the supermarket really are.
Okay.
And they specifically focused on protein content and on the bioavailability of zinc and iron.
And bioavailability just means how well our bodies can actually absorb and use those nutrients.
Right, exactly.
Got it.
Because just because a food has a certain amount of a nutrient doesn't necessarily mean our bodies can use all of it.
Right, makes sense. So how do they actually do this research? Like, what did their process look like?
Well, first they had to get a whole bunch of different cereal and pulse products from supermarkets in Adelaide, Australia.
Okay.
And they included all sorts of stuff like whole grains, split grains, coarsely ground grains, and flours made from cereals like brown and white rice, brown and white, yellow and white corn oats, durum wheat, the whole gamut.
Wow.
Plus, of course, they had chickpeas and lentils. Oh, and they also threw in buckwheat and tapioca just for comparison.
Interesting.
Then they took all of these samples to the lab and analyzed them for a few key things.
Okay, so what were they looking for specifically in these samples?
So they measured the amount of phytic acid in each sample.
Phytic acid. That's not a term we hear every day.
Yeah, phytic acid is a natural compound found in plant-based foods. But the thing about it is, it can actually bind to certain minerals in your gut, like zinc and iron, and make it harder for your body to absorb them.
Ah, so it's kind of like a nutrient blocker in a way.
Exactly, it can be.
Interesting.
Then they also measured the concentrations of different elements in the samples.
Like what?
Things like phosphorus, zinc, and iron, the good stuff.
Okay.
And of course, they measure the protein content in each product.
Makes sense.
Oh, and for the grains, they were careful to compare both whole grain and milled versions.
So like brown rice versus white rice.
Exactly.
Okay. So they were looking at the things that make a food nutritious, but also at things that can actually prevent us from absorbing those nutrients.
Yep, that's a good way to put it.
Now, you mentioned bioavailability earlier.
Right.
So how exactly did they measure or estimate how well our bodies would absorb the zinc and iron from these foods?
Well, they used something called molar ratios, basically.
Sure.
The ratio of phytic acid to zinc and the ratio of phytic acid to iron in each sample. These ratios can give us a pretty good idea of how likely that phytic acid is to actually bind to those minerals in your digestive system and prevent your body from absorbing them.
So a higher ratio means less absorption.
Exactly. And a lower ratio generally means better absorption.
Okay, got it.
And to make sure they were interpreting these ratios correctly, they used guidelines from the World Health Organization and research from experts like Harrell and Egley, who've done a lot of work on this.
So they were using some pretty solid scientific benchmarks to figure all of this out.
Precisely.
All right, so let's get to the good stuff. What did they actually find? What were the main takeaways from all of this?
One of the biggest findings, and this was a surprise to me, was that pulse products like chickpeas and lentils were consistently better sources of protein and minerals than the cereal products.
Interesting.
Yeah, especially when it came to zinc and iron. They found much higher levels in the chickpeas and lentils compared to things like wheat, corn, and tapioca.
Do you have any like specific numbers for us to give us a sense of the difference?
Yeah, so on average, chickpeas had around 28.6 milligrams of zinc per kilogram and 48.5 milligrams of iron per kilogram.
Okay.
And lentils were very similar, coming in at about 27.2 milligrams of zinc and almost 49.5 milligrams of iron per kilogram.
Wow, those are some impressive numbers. So those are some pretty big differences.
They are.
So it sounds like not only do these pulses have more of these important nutrients, but our bodies can actually use more of them too.
Exactly, and that's because of those molar ratios we were talking about earlier.
Right.
Since chickpeas and lentils had higher levels of zinc and iron to begin with, and their phytic acid levels weren't drastically different, the ratios were generally lower, meaning better bioavailability.
Got it. So pulses are kind of like a win-win in that sense.
It seems that way.
Now, what about when they compared different types of cereals? Did
Yeah.
they find any differences between like whole grains and more processed or refined options?
Yeah, they did, and some of it was pretty much what you'd expect. Well, as you might guess, the whole grain cereals, like brown rice and whole wheat, had higher levels of phytic acid compared to their refined counterparts, like white rice and white wheat flour.
Which kind of makes sense since the bran and the germ are still there in the whole grains.
Right.
And those are the parts that contain most of the phytic acid.
Exactly.
So to put some numbers to it, the phytic acid content in brown rice was about 3 times higher than in white rice.
Right.
And in whole wheat, it was about 2 times higher than in white wheat flour.
Yep.
So even though we think of whole grains as being healthier overall, could this mean that we might not actually absorb as much of some of the good stuff because of that extra phytic acid?
That's a great question, and this study really brought that point home.
Interesting.
You see, while whole wheat products did have a lot more zinc, like 2.5 times more than white wheat products, which actually gave them better estimated zinc bioavailability.
Okay.
The situation with rice was a bit more complicated.
How so?
Well, the zinc content in rice really varied depending on the type.
Oh,
Some brown rice varieties had a lot of zinc, but they also had a lot of phytic acid, which sometimes actually meant that the estimated zinc bioavailability was lower than some types of white rice.
so it really is a bit of a balancing act then.
It is. You have to consider both how much of a nutrient is in the food and how easily your body can actually access it.
That's a great point. It's not always as simple as just looking at the label.
Nope.
Were there any other interesting findings within the cereal group?
Oh yeah, there were a few.
Okay.
For instance, they found that white corn had less phytic acid and a higher estimated iron bioavailability than yellow corn.
Interesting.
Oats were kind of an oddball.
Yeah.
They had low estimated zinc bioavailability, but relatively high iron bioavailability compared to the other cereals.
Uh-huh.
Buckwheat and durum wheat were not so great for zinc absorption because they had very high ratios of phytic acid to zinc.
Got it.
And then you have tapioca flour, which was interesting. It was super low in phytic acid, zinc, and iron overall. But because the phytic acid was so low, it actually ended up having a relatively higher estimated bioavailability for those minerals compared to some other flours.
So basically, even if a food isn't that nutrient rich, it can still have good bioavailability just because there's not much there to block absorption.
Exactly. It's all relative.
Fascinating. What about protein content? Were there any big surprises there?
Well, the protein content pretty much followed the same pattern as the mineral content lentils. Had the highest average protein content at around 26%, followed by chickpeas at about 22.6%.
Okay, that makes sense.
And tapioca and white corn were at the bottom of the list with almost no protein at all.
Not surprising.
Brown and white rice and whole wheat and white wheat flour were all kind of in the middle with similar protein levels.
So if you're looking for a plant-based protein, boost pulses are definitely the way to go.
It seems that way.
Now, I know the study also touched on the topic of food fortification. Can you tell us a bit about what they found there?
Right, so the researchers noticed that the levels of zinc and iron they found in some of those cereal products like wheat and oat flour were actually lower than what food standards Australia and New Zealand recommend for fortification.
Interesting.
And this raises some questions about whether current fortification strategies are really doing enough to tackle micronutrient deficiencies in the population.
That's a really important point.
It is. It's something we need to think about more.
Absolutely. And to really drive home the difference in nutritional value between pulses and cereals, the researchers actually did some calculations based on their data, right?
They did. It was pretty interesting, actually.
What did they find?
Well, based on Australian nutrient guidelines, they figured out that eating about 280 grams of dried chickpeas or lentils could give you 100% of your daily recommended zinc intake if you're a woman and about 57% if you're a man.
Wow.
But if you ate the same amount of white rice or white wheat flour, you'd be getting way less zinc.
Okay, so that really puts it into perspective.
It shows you just how much more bang for your buck you can get from pulses.
Absolutely. So all of this is really interesting, but what does it all mean for our listeners? What are the practical implications of these findings for everyday life?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we should all be trying to eat a wider variety of foods.
Makes sense.
And specifically, we should all think about adding more pulses like chickpeas and lentils into our diets.
Good advice.
You know, they're packed with protein, zinc, and iron, and our bodies are really good at absorbing those nutrients from pulses.
And this is especially important for people who might be at risk of micronutrient deficiencies, right?
Exactly.
That's
So
good.
for growing kids, pregnant women, anyone who might need a little extra boost.
Okay, good to know. I think this research also highlights how important it is to think about how food processing can affect nutritional value.
Absolutely.
You know, like when we mill grains to make white rice or white flour,
Right.
we might be losing out on some of the nutrients and phytic acid that were originally there. So while whole grains are generally better for you, we also have to remember that that higher phytic acid content can affect how much of those minerals we actually absorb.
That's a great point. It's all about balance.
Right.
And it really emphasizes the importance of looking at both the quantity of a nutrient and its bioavailability.
I like how you put that quantity versus quality in a way.
Yeah, and you know, those molar ratios are a useful tool for estimating bioavailability, but they're even more helpful when you consider them alongside the actual amounts of those nutrients in the food.
Makes sense. Now, this information also has implications for things like food fortification programs, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Which are designed to help combat micronutrient deficiencies.
Exactly. And what this study suggests is that we might need to rethink the levels of fortification in some of those commonly eaten cereal products.
To make sure they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Precisely, it's an ongoing process.
For sure. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on one more thing, that the study mentioned the link between phytic acid and phosphorus in whole grain products.
Okay.
Can you explain why that connection is important for our listeners to understand?
Sure. So in cereal grains, a large portion of the phosphorus is actually stored in the form of phytic acid.
Interesting.
So it makes sense that the researchers found a strong correlation between those two, especially in whole grains like brown rice and whole wheat.
Right.
It basically just confirms our understanding of where these compounds are located within the grain and how they might interact in our bodies.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, of course, no study is perfect, and this one had a few limitations that the researchers themselves acknowledged. Can you tell us a bit about those?
Sure. So first of all, this study was done in a specific location, Adelaide, Australia,
Right.
and at a specific time, so the results might not be exactly the same in other parts of the world or even at different times of the year.
Because different varieties of crops might be available, or different processing methods might be used?
Exactly. And secondly, remember those bioavailability estimates we were talking about? Well, those were based on those molar ratios, which are good indicators, but they're still just estimates.
Right. They don't necessarily reflect exactly what happens in a real live human being.
Exactly. To get a truly accurate picture, you need to do studies directly with people.
Okay.
And the last limitation is that the researchers only analyzed one packaged product of each type.
So there could be some variation between different brands or even different batches of the same product.
Right. It's always good to keep that in mind.
That's a good point. So we've talked about the findings and the limitations, but what did the experts who actually conducted this study have to say about their own work?
Well, one of the researchers, TDM Nguyen, she's the doctoral candidate.
Okay.
She emphasized that pulse products really are excellent sources of zinc and iron,
Okay.
and that they generally outperformed the cereal products in this regard.
Okay.
And she also reminded us about how that phytic acid in cereals can sometimes limit nutrient absorption.
Right. We've talked about that.
And Dr. Stephanie Watts-Fox, who's the leader of the research group,
Right.
she highlighted how their findings really showed that pulses were better sources of both protein and minerals with better micronutrient bioavailability.
So the research team was pretty confident in their findings then.
It seems that way.
And it sounds like they're doing even more research in this area.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Watts-Fox mentioned that they're currently looking at ways to increase nutrient bioavailability in crops by naturally reducing phytic acid levels through different agricultural techniques.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It is, imagine if we could make our food even more nutritious.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting area of research.
For sure. So to bring this all together for our listeners, what's the bottom line here? What should people take away from this deep dive into the research?
Well, I think the key message is that we should all try to include a wider variety of foods in our diets, especially pulses like chickpeas and lentils.
Great advice.
These foods are nutritional powerhouses, and they're often overlooked, but they're packed with protein, zinc, iron, and other important nutrients.
And our bodies are really good at using those nutrients.
Exactly.
And it's not just about adding pulses either. It's about being more mindful of the nutritional content of the foods we eat regularly.
Absolutely.
You know, we should be looking beyond just calories and thinking about micronutrients and bioavailability.
That's a great point. We need to start thinking differently about what makes a meal truly nutritious.
Right. And this research really challenges us to do that.
It does. It makes you wonder how our ideas about healthy breakfast and other meals might need to change in light of these findings.
It's definitely food for thought.
It is.
So what are some practical ways that people can actually incorporate more pulses into their meals? Do you have any suggestions?
Oh, absolutely. There are so many delicious ways to use pulses.
Like what?
Well, you can add lentils to soups, throw some chickpeas in your salads, use chickpea flour in baking. The possibilities are endless.
Those are all great ideas.
And there are tons of recipes and resources out there to help you get started.
That's awesome. Maybe you could even challenge yourself to try a new pulse-based recipe this week.
That's a great idea. It's a simple way to boost your nutrient intake.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining us and sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
And thanks to everyone listening for tuning in. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of nutrition and health.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.